20. Theft and Law. The 8th Commandment reads very simply, "Thou shalt not steal." Exodus chapter 20, verse 15. Of this there is little question. Theft is forbidden, and clearly so. It is necessary to ask, to whom does this law apply? The usual answer by churchmen is, why, to all men, of course. And this answer is faulty. The commandment applies to all men and to their institutions, corporations, and forms of government. Failure to extend the law to its full jurisdiction has been productive of more than a little evil. At the root of this error is the unhappy fact that most churchmen treat the commandments as simple matters of morality, not as law. The Mosaic Law is indeed a moral code, but it is inescapably law as well. To deny the Mosaic legislation its force as law is to surrender the world to the devil. In one of the most incisive studies of the law, Frederick Niemeyer, who titled his study, Essays Against Organized Sanctimony and Legalized Coercion, wrote in criticism of the ideas of Dr. Bruin Slot, stating, "Everything stands or falls on this simple question. Does a government have more authority than its citizens? If so, it must have got that authority from some greater source than the citizens. The only greater sources are God or Satan. Satan is never considered by Calvinists to be the source of governments. Governments are manifestations of the common grace of God. Therefore, Hitler had a peculiar inherent authority directly from God." Now we can realize how the Standard came to follow the course it did during World War II. Grant the foregoing to Abraham Kuyper in the Standard, to the Anti-Revolutionary Party and to Bruin's Slot, and where do you end up? Here are 4 propositions that follow naturally from Bruin's Slot's major idea. 1. God has restricted individual men by and to the 10 Commandments. 2. But God has given to government more authority or rights than individual men have. 3. Therefore, governments have direct authority to go beyond the 10 Commandments, that is, they may violate the 10 Commandments. 4. It is exactly that right to violate the 10 Commandments which constitutes the purpose of claiming a peculiar inherent authority for government. Hitler, you see, was operating quite within his rights derived directly from God. Concentration camps, firing squads, lies, violence, wars, oppression, all these are products of the peculiar inherent authority of governments. Men are bound by the Decalogue, governments are not. Niemeyer, who with Ingram stands almost alone in doing justice to the biblical law, has stated the case clearly. All authority is either from God or Satan. If authority is from God, then it is either under God's law and an agency of God's law, or else it has some special pipeline to God, which enables it to sidestep God's law. And for this, Scripture gives no evidence. In a delightful footnote, Niemeyer added, "A person reading this manuscript with some amusement worked out the obvious syllogisms. 1. The powers that be are ordained of God. 2. Satan is one of the powers that be. 3. Therefore, Satan is ordained of God." Then he outlined the succeeding syllogism. 1. All the powers ordained of God must be obeyed. 2. Satan is a power ordained of God. 3. Therefore, Satan must be obeyed. Such absurd thinking is far from absent in evangelical circles. In July 1967, this writer became the target of a demand for investigation as one teaching false doctrines because of a film strip text entitled, "The Moral Foundations of Money." In that text, unbacked paper money was called a form of counterfeiting, and inflation a form of larceny. One of the accusations made by the Reverend Albert G. Edwards of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was as follows. This is accusing the state of robbery, which seems to go quite contrary to what Paul says in the 13th chapter of Romans, where we are told to give what is asked of us in regard to taxation and to recognize the right of the state in this. Edwards spoke of paper money inflation as a hidden tax rather than larceny. To call taxation larceny seems to be an act of open rebellion against the state and contrary to Scripture, which admonishes us to be subject to the ordinances of men for God's sake. On August 7, 1967, this writer answered in part as follows. You speak of paper money as a form of hidden tax, which is true, but your point with regard to Romans chapter 13 I do not regard as valid. You yourself, I have heard, criticize certain actions of civil government as morally wrong, or in various ways wrong. Did you impugn thereby Scripture? Elijah called the Caesar of Naboth's vineyard theft and murder. Was he impugning God's law? The state has a legitimate authority, but not everything it does is thereby legitimate. As Hodge, in another context than Romans chapter 13, says of all authority, it extends over all departments of its domain, but is limited in all, first, by the nature of the relation, and secondly, by the higher authority of God. The work of the ministry must be prophetic, that is, it must speak for God, and it must therefore deny to the state what belongs to God. The state thus has no right, for example, to usurp the education of children. This is a responsibility of the covenant, of parents, not the state. The state has no right to violate God's law. Thou shalt not steal, and paper money is theft, and what you call a hidden tax is actually hidden theft. I cannot hold to the immunity of the state from moral judgment. In too many churchmen, we find the exemption of the state from the law and from judgment in terms of the law. The roots of this position go back to pagan divinization of the state. Practically, where men exempt the state from the law of God, they make it an instrument of Satan. The law is the law for everyone. If the citizen has no moral right to steal, neither does the state. If the citizen cannot expropriate his neighbour's property, neither can the state. Thou shalt not steal applies to corporations, governments, and men equally. It forbids socialism, communism, inflation, bad checks, and every other form of theft. It forbids false advertising and dishonest processing and adulteration of foods. It forbids feather bedding by workers' associations, and it forbids the cheating of workers. All men, their institutions, corporations, and forms of government are equally under the law of God. The reduction of the 10 Commandments to the status of a moral code only is the destruction of the law. If all authority is not under God, then instead of a universe, we have a multiverse. Instead of one creator and lawgiver, we have many gods acting as creators and lawgivers in their realms. If all authority comes from God, then all authority is plainly under God's law word and entirely subject to it. Thou shalt not steal cannot then be restricted to the individual man, but must be applied to every area of life. The concept of a multiverse has become prominent in the 20th century, and with it, the consequences of polytheism. Pre-Christian paganism, being evolutionary, was also polytheistic. The world has seen multiple origins and hence had multiple gods. In the 20th century, educators have spoken of the university at times as a multiversity, having room for a variety of ideas and faiths. The teaching of witchcraft, astrology, and related concepts by some schools is related to this concept of the multiversity. High schools in a major city have introduced yoga and palmistry. If the world is a multiverse, then all things are permissible, except a sovereign God and a universal law order. Hence, our polytheistic world is tolerant of almost every kind of belief, except Orthodox Christianity. A universal law order and a sovereign God rule out the possibility of a polytheistic multiverse. But because the sovereign and triune God of Scripture rules, there is no multiverse, but rather a universe, and a unified law order. The law, thou shalt not steal, applies therefore not only to the state, but to the church as well. Where the church does not faithfully teach the whole counsel of God, his entire law word, it is then plainly guilty of theft. It is robbing the people and the social order of its vital nerve. It is undercutting all authority when it limits the law on which all authority rests. As Niemeyer has observed, what gold is to money, the law of God is to liberty. Without the law of God, men, unions, corporations, and states feel free to be a law unto themselves, to play God. Failure to teach the law of God is thus to pave the way for tyranny. James Madison said of God's law, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God.